there are cycles. There are debt cycles. There's money and credit, and then there's real economic activity. Think about it the following, that what is happening is a cycle that began in 1945. We began a new monetary system. The world created the dollar as the world's currency at the end of World War II. And then we began a debt cycle. And spending power comes from money and credit. And so central banks create money and credit. And we have the world's most powerful central bank because the dollar is the world's currency. And we began a cycle. And that cycle allowed more and more stimulation, but we accumulated more and more debt. And the ability to do that diminishes as interest rates get closer to zero, because usually they stimulate by cutting interest rates. And when the interest rates hit zero, central banks have to print more money and buy more financial assets, which they did in 2008 the way they did it in 1933. And then the economy picks up on that, and we create more money and debt, and then you have a downturn. Now, this downturn came because of a virus, but whether it came for a virus or for any other reason, it's an economic downturn in which the central bank has a limited ability to be stimulative. So think of it this way. Every individual, every company, every country has a certain amount of income and a certain amount of expenses, and then a certain amount of savings. And when the income falls so that it's low, maybe even below the expenses, they have to dig into their savings. And so what we're experiencing now is, with a lot of debt, there was a fall in income that, and a lot of people and a lot of countries and a lot of companies don't have an adequate amount of savings. And so that's where the financial crisis comes from. If the virus never comes back again, think of it as like a tsunami that has produced, it recedes and there's still damage, and there's financial damage. And so what we see now are holes in income and holes in balance sheets. And then you're seeing the central bank, the world's central bank, the Federal Reserve, fill it in for Americans, try to fill it in for Americans. So you're seeing unprecedented amounts of creation of government debt, borrowing money, because where does it get the money from? It borrows from the Federal Reserve, and then it gives that money out to fill in those holes. So that's in the process that's happening. Very similar to, almost identical to March of 1933, when Roosevelt did the same thing. And it's happening at a time like back in the Great Depression, when there were relatively large wealth gaps. And because of those large wealth gaps, there are more political gaps, and there's going to be probably a lot more arguing about how the wealth pie should be divided. And so that's the mechanics, and it's happened through history. So figure, in every place there are these holes. And the United States, because 70% of the world's transactions, buying and selling, and about 70% of the storing of wealth outside the country, reserves and the like, is in US dollars. So the US has a monopoly on those dollars, almost. There's a European central bank, much smaller. There's a Japanese central bank, much smaller. China has a central bank. They could take care of the Chinese. But by and large, we're living in a world economy, because if you want to buy things, you pretty much have to buy them in dollars. Now, what's happening now is that the United States production of dollars is largely going to Americans, and that those who have financial holes that are often in dollars, there's about $60 trillion of debt. In other words, it's owed in dollars. that is owed by non-Americans. And as a result of that, they need dollars. And it's going to be much more difficult for them to get dollars to pay that debt. That's one of the big things that's going on. So in Europe, it's a bit better than that. They're going through a similar process. In China, they can manage that. Japan can manage that. They also have savings, large savings. You can measure it in reserves. But a lot of the rest of the world is going to have to look to its own balance sheet. And it's going to look, some countries, you could look to their savings, you could look to their reserves, and you say, how much do they have in savings? Even the rich countries. Think about oil producing countries. Their revenues are a lot less than their expenses. And then they have savings, quite substantial savings. But that savings is going to have to be drawn down. They're going to have to sell assets and draw that down. And so a lot of the world will not be protected. The primary protection mechanism for doing this is the IMF. And the IMF has about $1 trillion in assets. And now they're arguing about how much money should be put out for supporting, the G20 countries. How much would they chip in to support it? And it's unlikely to be very much. So those other places are going to have a shortage of hard currency. They manufacture their own currencies, of course, but those are not widely accepted. They're not widely accepted for international transactions, and they're not widely accepted for savings. And so that diminishes the value. When they print those currencies, that diminishes the value of those currencies because there's not that much demand. And so I think it's going to be very difficult for those countries. There are two kinds of inflation. There's the supply and demand inflation. In other words, when the demand for something is high and there's not enough of it, it goes up in price. And then there's monetary inflation. Monetary inflation means that you print a lot of money, and even though the economy can be very weak, you can have a monetary inflation because the supply of money and credit increases so much faster than the goods and services, even though there's not much demand for that. So it'll depend on which country you're in. All this printing of money and credit right now in the United States is to fill in holes in the balance sheets. So in and of itself, rather than causing a higher level inflation in a place like the United States or Europe or Japan, what it's going to do is reduce a greater amount of deflation, and because it's just filling in those holes. However, we should talk about what is the value of money, what is the storehold of wealth. But when you get into other countries, that's not true. So they will have the printing of their own money. It won't be in much demand. And yes, there is a significant likelihood that they will experience monetary inflation, even while the world has a shortage of demand. We estimate that the amount of losses in the United States, in terms of actual losses, is in the vicinity of about $5 trillion, and that the losses in the world is a bit over $20 trillion. And then, of course, it differs from, so you just can't put that number out. You've got to get it in the right places. Right now, I would say it's still short in the United States and not getting necessarily in the right places. And in the rest of the world, it's still significantly short. And so as the world is intertwined, the balance sheet problems and the income problems of other places are going to matter, even if the virus did not play any role in the future. Of course, there's some likelihood, significant likelihood that it will. That's a whole other subject. But it looks like the amount still isn't enough, and worse so in the rest of the world than it is in the United States. And it's not necessarily all getting in the right hands at the right speed, so it's going to be difficult. I believe in the capitalist profit-making system because it's the best allocation of resource, and it creates if it creates equal opportunity, it's great. Because if the revenue that comes in is not greater than the expenses, and so in other words, what you're putting out is not greater than what you're taking in to make it, the system reallocates resources, and it also brings capital to those who can do that. But it's not complete in that there are dimensions, a lot of dimensions